so much for coming. Ah, my God, applause, I've missed it. My name is Jazmine Hughes. I'm a Metro reporter for the New York Times, and I'm so happy to be with you all tonight. So, Josh, as I was asking, I would love for you to tell us a little bit about what compelled you to write this book, especially after Nonstop Metropolis. I wonder if those two projects spoke to each other.
Absolutely. I mean, the short way to answer that question is we just got out of this pandemic thing, and I needed a project, so I wrote a book. It's not actually true. I had signed up to write the book before the pandemic, but it was oddly helpful in getting the thing done. But no, absolutely, it grew from Nonstop Metropolis in certain ways, which is this atlas that I worked on that was a collection of maps and essays about the city, which was predicated in certain ways on the idea that anyone who lives in a city could map it in their own way. So the city contains at least as many maps as it does people, right? And one of the things that project involved was just getting immersed, for obvious reasons, in the place names of the city and sort of thinking about these signifiers that sort of are the means by which we navigate our days. They're the ways in which we sort of form identities and sort of figure out who we are and where we're from. And so this book in certain ways grew out of that, absolutely. But also just out of this question about all of us, it's true, could map the city in our own ways, but we also share these words, all of us who live here, and we may attach different meanings to them. But I really wanted to sort of get into, in a sense, just a research project and a kind of riff project, writing an essay about where names come from. Names are an amazing way just to uncover the layers of the city and who shaped it. But they're also, it seemed to me, this incredible way that we sort of understand not only history, but the present. And I think they've become newly politicized in recent years. And it's also the case that it was just fun to get into where names come from. You know, we're here in Red Hook, and you sort of go outside and you look at the, you know, the Buttermilk Channel here. That's what the water's called. And you say, oh, it's just a fun fact that that place is named perhaps for the dairy farmers from Brooklyn years ago who would take their butter to Manhattan to sell. And the legend says that, you know, it's so rough on the water that it would turn it into butter. I don't think it was actually that rough. But in any case, that's sort of, there's a sort of first order of just fun, and sort of it deepens your sense of this place to sort of understand where names come from. But it seemed to me that there was also space to just kind of get into an essay about the ways in which names become a part of the places that they describe, and the ways in which place names have this kind of magical power to become a part of place. And I'm a geographer who's also a writer, so I think I have a thing for place, that's for sure, but I also have a thing for words. So, you know, place names. And more than that, names of New York. I said it to a friend and I said, oh, it's the sequel to Gangs of New York. You gotta do it. Names of New York. So in any case, that's a bit of how the book came to be.
Will, do you want to weigh in on how the book came to be for Josh? No, I'm kidding.
Well, Josh,
I'm actually wondering, speaking of this magical power, a question for both of you, considering that you're particularly well-heeled, is what sort of feelings have you guys experienced being evoked in particular place names? There have been so many conversations about, you know, schools named after like a Robert E. Lee or something, and I wonder if over the course of your life, have any particular place names really evoked a strong feeling in you, good or bad?
Such an interesting question. I think, you know, one way to think about that is that I got into just thinking about the name of New York itself, right? And New York, I think one thing about a city like New York, a sort of global city that's become iconic in all kinds of ways, is that it exerts this pull, right? It's like we sort of say, oh, New York, what does that mean? And it signifies certain things, it sort of alludes to certain things for different people. And I have sort of family history here, but I've only lived here for 12 years or so. So New York had a certain pull, as did certain parts of the city, like, you know, Brooklyn evokes certain things, Harlem evokes certain things. And I was just really interested to think about, as the geographer Yifu Tuan puts it, the ways in which a great city is made up not just of stone, but of words. And those words, of course, are place names. So for me, New York is one that's exerted a pull. I'm sort of wedded to this place and the idea of this place, for sure. But one of the sort of germs for this book, I think, was to dig into sort of where the name York even comes from, right? There's an easy way to say, oh, New York, it comes from, the English came here in 1664, and they were sponsored by the Duke of York, and that's how the name came about. But then you dig a little deeper, and you say, oh, York comes from a Celtic word, Jorvik, which meant where the yew tree grows, and then it sort of became the Romans were in charge in England, right? And it became Forwick, and then became Jorvik, a Viking word, and then finally became York to the English. But it's interesting just to ponder the sort of songs and ways in which New York became iconic to me. One of them, for example, you could think of course, there's the sort of Frank Sinatra, New York, New York, but then there's the, Nas, NY State of Mind. And it's funny to think of Nas sort of hymning the Duke's new place of the yew tree. I love it. So to sort of just get into sort of what these words actually mean. So it's a long way of answering your question, just to say that New York is a place name that matters to me deeply. And in Nonstop Metropolis, in that Atlas project, one of the maps that we did, for example, was to think about all the songs that actually not only sort of praise and sort of evoke New York, but evoke actual places here. All the sort of streets and neighborhoods and so on that have actual songs and records associated with them. And we prevailed on Will, for example, we asked Will what he would like to do. He wrote a little essay about Take the A Train, which isn't a place, it's a train. But in any case, there's those sort of songs and the sort of things that, the sort of cultural texts that become symbolic of place have always fascinated me.
I lived for a long time in Montreal, a great city, but very Catholic in its names. St. Catherine runs into Saint Laurent, it's all bishops and saints, and what I appreciate about New York is some of the bedrock of it is a bit more mysterious. Even like the Dutch the Dutch names don't instantly conjure. I mean, they are a colonial power and did horrible things, but it mostly just conjures up like, oh, that's a lot of V's. Like, oh, Van Brunt. Like, oh, that doesn't conjure up a legacy in the same way that St. Catherine or Saint Laurent has like this full history of church behind it. And I'm like, every time I cross Union Street, I'm like, yeah, fucking Union. Or like past Grand Army Plaza, I'm like, yes, Union Army, let's go, Grand, like, yeah, go to hell.
I'd love to go on a walking tour with you one day and just watch you react to the street signs as you walk down the street.
But there are thorny parts of New York, but there's also so many numbers and letters. I live on Avenue C now, and you can kind of project emotions onto places. So like 3 years ago, I was looking for a financial advisor. I did not find one, but I met with one in a building at 53rd and 3rd in Manhattan.
The Ramones?
It was just like, oh, 53rd and 3rd, that's where you meet with your financial advisor now. And how 42nd Street now conjures like, I don't really want to go to 42nd Street, but I can picture a romance to it. And there's like a bit of it's not entirely a neutrality, but there is a bit more possibility. But there's also like reams and reams of history to uncover, which like every single page in your book, I was like, right, like, oh, right, oh, okay, wow, okay, well, all right, well, here we go. So there is so much history there, but it's not always like stabbing you in the eye with a syringe.
Yeah, and this is, one of the things that it's good to not be stabbed in the eye with a syringe. We can all agree on
as
that.
many cities do.
Yeah, But no, one of the things that's unique too about digging into place names in a city in the Americas, as opposed to Europe or even other parts of the world, the so-called Old World, right, is that those layers, I just invoke those of York itself. They go way back. They go back centuries. The thing about a young city is that the layers, there's often several layers, but if you do the work, you can sort of dig into those layers and sort of figure out where they come from, right? It's sort of on the surface in a sense. And I loved learning, these things like, Gramercy Park. There's so many names that became English words, but were just riffs on the Dutch.
Right.
And because people like the sound of them. So it's like Gramercy was like the Gros Marsh, the crooked marsh of that part of Manhattan. Coney Island means something in Dutch. It means Rabbit Island. But these English sort of showed up. I said, oh, that sounds all right. We'll call it Coney Island. But then I think more sort of evocatively perhaps, I think of, you think of iconic names in New York, and obviously so many neighborhoods have those, even intersections. You just invoked 53rd and 3rd. You could do sort of songs for any number of places. Linden Boulevard in Queens, no one knew or cared about it before Tribe Called Quest. That is, who wasn't living there from that part of Queens. But in any case, I think, for example, of Harlem. And Harlem is, this is, okay, these Dutch guys are wandering around Upper Manhattan in the early 1600s, and they're sort of from this little village outside Amsterdam. They say, why don't we call it that, Harlem? And what to me is interesting about that is, of course, Harlem now is not evocative of the Netherlands touch. It's evocative of this, remarkable history going back a century and more of Harlem as this sort of mecca and icon of Black freedom and culture and pride. And there's a way in which it's a fascinating sort of process by which the sounds of a word, and I think part of the thing about Harlem is there's so many wonderful songs and poems and works of literature that evoke those two syllables, Harlem, right? And I'm thankful for the fact the English, true story, when they took over, there was a kind of push. They wanted to rename Harlem Lancaster. And thank God they didn't, because the Lancaster Renaissance just doesn't have the same ring.
That was in the 1580s, right? The Lancaster Renaissance.
Yeah,
It was like
Lancaster Renaissance, really jazzy, sexy time, So, here's to that. But it's a remarkable thing, just the ways in which I think to think about, and you asked before about, right, there's all this conversation now about when and why we change names, and that's a vital conversation, and it's a remarkable thing to witness as someone who cares about place and cares about history, the ways in which people are accessing sort of ways to think about place and to think about history through their names. That's something I care about, so it's a wonderful thing to see. But I think it is a complex conversation in part because people have had the power over time to change the meaning of names. I don't know that we're in a position to change the meaning of Robert E. Lee, certainly, but clearly we were in a position over centuries to change the meaning of Harlem. And I think that that's a fascinating thing just to think about why and how that happens. And to me, as someone who cares about words, I think part of it is just about, some words hit our ears right, and some words are just like, ooh, that sounds good. And Harlem is one of them, so, yeah.
Well, this actually brings me to one thing you talk about is this sort of positive or good-hearted effort to supplant the name of something. And Harlem is a great example by this renaming that you discuss of 125th Street, 125, of MLK Jr. Boulevard, and how we have all these place names, whether intentional or not, and sometimes they're strictly numerical, that become a stand-in for a very concept. And to have a body of legislation come in and try to really put a rubber stamp to really make the concept official, this concept of Black pride and liberation, is actually sort of condescending and goes against the very thing that the street stands for. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, that's a great example right there, is that, of course, 125th Street, sort of in this moment in the 1970s and 80s when cities and towns around the country, right, were sort of renaming streets. It's like every town of a certain size now has an MLK Boulevard, right? And there's obviously an important and sort of potent reason for that that's worth celebrating. But it's a fascinating thing that happened in New York, where that happened here. And by the way, 125th also, of course, crosses Lenox, which was renamed or given a second name, I should say, like MLK, of Malcolm X Boulevard. Few people in Harlem call either of those things by either of those names, because over decades previous, 125th Street had become iconic of these very values that you just articulated. And similarly with Malcolm X, it's like, no, Lenox and the 125th sort of does the work. They've taken on those meanings because of, I think, the ways in which people had grown attached to them and composed songs about them and written poems about them and all the rest. And it's fascinating, though, because it happens all over the city. It's like sometimes there'll be a kind of a renaming for whatever reason. Another funny example is, Avenue of the Americas, 6th Avenue, right? And this was this scheme, Fiorello LaGuardia in the 40s. They felt like he sort of was talking to business owners and different people around there and said, we need to revive 6th Avenue. It doesn't have the cachet of 5th Avenue. says, oh, great, let's call it Avenue of the Americas, and add, we're going to sort of have all the embassies from Latin America and have these nice street lamps with the sort of logos or flags of different countries and so on. No one liked that name. Avenue of the Americas. It was sort of, it's on there, it's still on there. But in the 80s, the city sort of relented and said, okay, no one wants Avenue of the Americas. We're just going to leave it 6th Avenue. So, the first utility of names, of street names, of course, is to get around, and people need to like them and sort of use them in that way. But New York is, I'm deeply attached to New York. I love New York. It's a remarkable place to think about all these things. But of course, you could do this project anywhere. But I think one of the unique things about New York is just the incredibly prolific or promiscuous way in which we've really gotten into renaming recently, or at least adding honorary names, of which there are many.
So I wanted to talk to you about co-naming. So there's this process that I learned about in your book, for those of you who don't know, that it's much easier to co-name a street or a landmark, maybe, or maybe just streets, in New York than it is to rename them. I feel as if, I wrote in my notes that unless you're like a Kennedy or a Cuomo, you can actually get some shit renamed for you. It's just like, and Jazmine Hughes Boulevard or something. And I wonder if there will actually ever be a push to, well, I guess my question is 2 questions. For the both of you, how do you feel about co-naming? Is it legit, is what I scribbled in my notes. And secondly, will there ever be a point in which we are actually permanently renaming these institutions or these streets or what have you for the people who deserve it, or are things going to be forever like, also Shirley Chisholm State Park? Shirley Chisholm State Park is a bad example, but also MLK Jr. Boulevard. Will we ever really change things like the way we've changed the Triborough Bridge, for example?
Totally. It's an interesting story. Part of it is that, so the local law that kind of brought about this incredible kind of flourishing of renaming took place in 1992. It was called Local Law 28. And basically it made it much easier for city council to add these honorary names. And part of the reason that happened, names had been added to the map, honorary names from the city, sort of sporadically down the decades. There's a few Yankees who have streets in the Bronx. There's Lou Gehrig Place and Mickey Mantle Street and so on. But it was pretty rare. It didn't happen that much. But essentially, there was a law passed that made it much easier for city council to sort of do this. And of course, initially it was 1992, so a lot of the first ones were for Columbus, because it was the quincentennial, and he had a rather nicer reputation 30 years ago than he does now. But then it became this way to, of course, honor neighborhood heroes, honor politicians, honor, policemen and firemen who'd been, killed in the line of duty, people who died untimely deaths, cultural heroes, icons, activists, all sorts of people, right? And so it's become quite a thing. And so you have, any number of, I had fun. There's a chapter in the book where I talked to this guy, a wonderful old fellow called Gilbert Tauber, who's in his 80s, who worked for the city as a planner for most of his career. And he told me that part of the reason the city council pushed through this sort of new law was that literally the people who were sort of making the city map, who it's kept on these huge sheets of Mylar. I don't mean a digital version, like there's actually a city map that they keep for tax purposes and so on. They hated it whenever there was an official name change. So they said, okay, let's make there be a way where you can do honorary street names. And so next thing you knew, there's Regis Philbin Street and what do you have?
Like a Sesame Street, you talked about.
Well, Sesame Street just came about a few years ago. And now there's like this flourishing, there's Notorious B.I.G. Way, and you have Woody Guthrie Street.
Do the Right Thing Way.
We got Do the Right Thing Way. We got Manny the Wrong Man Balistrero Way in Jackson Heights, who had an Alfred Hitchcock film made after him. The Scrabble Corner, one of my favorites. And I'll get to the question of whether we feel good about this or not. I think Will has views. The Scrabble Corner, it's impossible not to like, because it's in Jackson Heights. It's in this part of Queens, which of course is this incredible linguistic melting pot. More languages are spoken there than anywhere. And there's this beautiful fact that, the most popular word game in history was invented there in Jackson Heights. And about 20 years ago, someone essentially changed the street sign there on 37th Avenue in Jackson Heights to essentially just give a numerical value, right, the sort of subscript to each of the letters on the sign. And people grew to love it, and it was there for a few years. It was kind of DIY urbanism, right? And finally, the kind of city council, the local city council person, essentially convinced the city to make it official. The DOT had taken it down for a couple of years, said, no, we need this thing. So Scrabble Corner's fabulous, and there are many that are great. It's interesting, though, to think about if there's too many, because I think that, as I said, a few minutes ago, I think that the primary kind of utility, obviously the utility of street names is that they help us get around. But there is this whole kind of second-order geography in New York of sort of adding honorary names.
Which is my experience of just going around the city. Normally when I see an honorary name, like, please just tell me the real name. Like, please just tell me what street I'm on. Like, I don't want to know this other thing. But in the book, you latch on to adding context. And the man who you talk to, who's like making a database of the context, which is, and then there's like all these moving stories of people who live in neighborhoods, and the people in the neighborhoods have that context, and it is like a meaningful thing. You're like, all right, this isn't necessarily for me, like looking up for my Google Maps and being like, what goddamn street am I on? It's like for a different purpose a little bit, and it's like being in your parents' house and there being like some dumb lamp, and you're like, please get rid of the dumb lamp, and there's like, this dumb lamp came from World War II, and you're like, okay, now it makes sense. And so getting that, you're like, okay, this becomes part of the fabric instead of just some random superstructure that's just like slapped on top.
No, and it's a wonderful way to sort of dig into this database of like figuring out, the guy, for example, who invented coco helado, wonderful coconut ice cream in the Bronx. He's got Mr. Thibodeau. He's got a street corner. Wonderful.
There's like 6 ice cream makers with
Yeah,
honorary
Chubby
streets or something
Campanella
like.
down in Bensonhurst, very important. Can't forget him. No, ice cream vendors. There's tons of ice cream vendors. I think there's 11 men called Frank in Queens who have streets named after them. So Queens is the champion of Frank streets. All kinds of stuff. There's a way in which you can sort of dig into these things, and it's marvelous. But no, to your question about sort of how and when we actually make names official, I think that's it is a sort of weightier question, and I think that New York, in a certain sense, has done a kind of end around by having these honorary names, because it's a way to kind of, add these sort of shout outs to people without changing the literal geography of the place. And I think you can sort of go either way with that. But it is, of course, it's important to note that the city, monuments, which of course are sort of less subtle form of sort of celebration of people, and monuments, I would contend statues are sort of impossible to do right, at least if they're way above us, sort of looming down on us, though it's important, absolutely, to sort of celebrate different histories and so on. But the city is, making this effort now, having noted that, for example, with statues, there was something like 195, I believe, statues of actual, real men, figures from history who'd done various things as politicians or soldiers or awful doctors whose monuments are being removed from Central Park right now. And women, as for women, there was, we have a few imaginary women. We have Alice in Wonderland in Central Park. We got Miss Liberty in the harbor. But actual real women, up until a few years ago, there was, I think, 3 beyond those 2. There's like a Golda Meir, there's a Harriet Tubman in Harlem. And the city is making now this effort. There's these new statues, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in Central Park. And what else do we have? There's the Shirley Chisholm statue going up in Prospect Park. So there is a way in which, the city is making this effort to sort of mark public space in different ways. But I think street names, I remain agnostic about whether the honorary names are an unalloyed great thing or a sort of complex thing.
I find that the neighborhoods are almost a more malleable thing than the street name. Dumbo is just a real estate term, but it's very evocative. Like, I know exactly what Dumbo is. But like Little Haiti is an honorary name that's like actually like, oh yeah, I know that section of Flatbush is Little Haiti. Like there are, in a sense, or like Sunset Park, Chinatown, like 8th Avenue. Like these, the neighborhood names are shift in a way that's quite meaningful and that kind of quickly, I feel like, sweep through our consciousness in the city.
Totally. And I mean, one thing that I've been fascinated with and was fascinated to sort of research in the book is, of course, there's all these old enclaves which we don't know about or talk about now, in part because those groups were sort of assimilated into the kind of generic body of whiteness that is sort of mainstream American culture. Namely, Germans, for example. There was tons of, Rhinelanders Row, Rhinelanders Wharf, Germantown, Little Hamburg, all these things in the 19th century, because Germans were a kind of ethnic community, and then those street names and neighborhood names disappeared. Similar thing with Jews. There was all kinds of places called Jews Alley, Jew Street, all these things, which sound vaguely offensive at this point, but they were actual street names in the 19th century. And those things have disappeared. But today, and some of them, Little Haiti's a great example of ethnic communities, really sort of rallying and saying, no, we want to be recognized. This is important. We've sort of established a community here, and it's important. And so those are celebratory great things when Little Haiti happened. But there are many others, and I'm fascinated by this in terms of just placemaking, how people sort of forge the words that create a sense of place and of community. And we'll just mention, 8th Street in 8th Avenue, I should say, in Brooklyn, in South Brooklyn, Brooklyn Chinatown. And 8th Avenue is the kind of nickname to Chinese folks who live in that part of Brooklyn. And part of that, right, is the number 8 kind of signifies good luck and good fortune, right? It happens to be one of the main drags, but it's become the name for that place, which is not official yet. Fascinating. Jackson Heights is known to Colombian people there as Chapinero, which is basically a sort of riff on a neighborhood of that name in Bogota. So it signifies something to people. So there's a way in which neighborhood names, I think there's an organic process that happens.
And I've I live in Kensington, just east of here, Church Avenue on the FG. They're like the old people in the neighborhood still call Flatbush. There's still like, you get the generational shift behind what do these places mean.
Totally. Yeah, and I mean, and neighborhood names, of course, come from all kinds of places, but you just mentioned Dumbo, but all the sort of flourishing of acronym names is a wild thing. The first ones were Tribeca and Soho, which began as kind of, community-driven, these little artist associations kind of coined these cute-sounding names, and the real estate people got into it. And then it was all over, it was like...
Right, you talk so much about Bococa in the book.
Bococa.
I hope it never catches on, because I don't know how to pronounce it.
Bococa. And does people know what Bococa is, right?
Borum Hill, Cobble Hill, Carroll Gardens.
Right.
Isn't that terrible? It sounds like something you shouldn't eat.
No. And it's just sort of real estate huckster talk for, Brownstone, Brooklyn, Bococa. But here's a terrible one. Sobro.
Oh, yeah, South Bronx.
Let it never catch on, let us hope.
Please,
Sobro.
let's all
My friend
commit.
lived in Rambo right after the Manhattan Bridge overpass. Did not catch on.
Yeah.
Speaking of our words, Rego Park, Queens, right, comes from, like many neighborhoods, just the developer who built it. That was the Real Good Construction Corporation built Rego Park. They said,
Rego.
this is a cool name, let's do Rego Park.
And then Arvern in Queens, we were just talking about.
Arvern, very important. Speaking of just a place name that comes from the sound and how it sounds, Arvern by the sea, down on the water by the Rockaways, has its name because the developer, a guy called Mr. Vernum, his wife really liked how he signed his checks. He signed them R. Vernum. He said, we need to name this development Arvern by the sea, which is right by the Barbados Inlet, by the way, named for the island, of course, in the Caribbean, not far from Jamaica, Queens. And this has been a riddle for me, as someone who's spent a bit of time in the Jamaica and the Caribbean. That, you get on the LIRR, and there's the train to Babylon by way of Jamaica. And there's a lot of Jamaicans in Jamaica, Queens now, just like there are a lot of Mexicans in Corona, Queens. And like, what is going on with this? There's some mystical force going on here. And the etymology The initial etymology, for a long time, people said, oh, Jamaica, it's a word from the Lenape people, who were the first people in this part of the world when the Dutch showed up. It turns out that's not really the case. It seems that the English just named it after the island where they were making tons of money off enslaving people and growing sugar, like Jamaica Plain and Boston and so on. In any case, names come from all
some of their best
places.
work. Well, one thing that you talked about in the book is that there are around 70 street names in Brooklyn alone that are named for slaveholders, right? And when I was reading the book, I was thinking of this like guerrilla sticker marketing campaign in my neighborhood. I live in Crown Heights in Brooklyn, that I started seeing last summer that said like, John Bergen was a slaveholder. He owned TK number of slaves. Like Jim Nostrum was a slaveholder. And we've talked so much about like the jewels of knowledge that you've uncovered in this, but what was it like to really confront the violence that we really like live among every single day?
Absolutely. I mean, I think I spoke earlier just about the ways in which there is something that's really exciting and important, I think, happening now about the ways in which people are sort of using names to confront and sort of think about the layers of history that make up this place. There's a geographer, J.B. Jackson, who wrote once that landscape is history made visible. And it's a lovely quote, and it's a great way to sort of think about, if you're driving across the country and sort of meditating on Appalachia or the plains or whatever. But I've always been just as interested in the ways in which landscape is sort of not history made visible, the ways in which history is hidden. And I think that there's something happening here in New York that not only those sort of names that are named for colonists or people who owned slaves, but for example on Wall Street, and this came out of the sort of Occupy moment here some years ago, that there was a sort of movement to mark the fact that Wall Street was the site right by Water Street, which was the water line before it got sort of added to with fill, was the site of the main slave auction block in New York City. And so as a result of kind of activism, and there's an artist who sort of worked on this, there's a plaque there now on Wall Street that sort of states the ways in which, slavery and the Atlantic slave trade were intrinsic to American capitalism and to the development thereof and the development of Wall Street and so on. And so I think that sort of movements to mark those histories, I think, are absolutely vital and exciting right now. I think that, as you say, I love the fact that people are sort of thinking about those sort of dark histories and thinking about what to do with them. I think that I love the sort of guerrilla sticker campaign and say, oh, let's think about what this is. And I think, as I say, I think it's there's not an easy answer as to exactly how to synthesize these things and sort of make them speak on the landscape, but absolutely the sort of step of making those histories visible is vital. And it's something as someone who thinks about place and history and how they are entwined is immensely important.
Well, when you think about the layers, they're really, in a lot of places in America, you still have a layer of native place naming. And here it's almost just Manhattan, the meaning of which is, you know better than I, but it basically lost to history.
Yeah, place where we gathered wood for bows and arrows seems our best translation.
Yeah, but it's, you go to Massachusetts and there's still, you almost encounter it more, but here there's obviously a whole history below the Dutch that it's very much wiped away.
Yeah, and wiped away, and it's interesting though, because there are many that we don't think of as this, Rockaway from Liwakai, I think it means place. There's all these words that mean, they're about grasses and sand and sort of swampy places. Masbeth means bad water. Interesting.
Good to know.
Evocative of Newtown Creek, perhaps. Amagansett means good water, sort of the obverse of that. But it's funny, our relationship to native place names is curious in America in general, I think, because, there are a good many. There are 26 states that have names, that come from Native American names. One of them, by the way, Wyoming, comes from the Lenape, who lived in this part of the world, when the Dutch showed up. Wyoming is actually a Lenape word, and it comes from flat place, and there's a Wyoming Valley in Pennsylvania. And there was a popular poem in the 19th century, Gertrude of Wyoming, and these settlers who were kind of trundling across the plains were thinking of that word when they named Wyoming, Wyoming. So there's a curious way in which sort of colonists and kind of mainstream American culture has sort of at once invested in or sort of avowed native place names because of the kind of sense of romance around them or some sense of noble savagery or whatever it is, while kind of also enacting a genocide against the people who spoke those languages.
And one of the details that I loved in the book is you talked about Borum Hill. Before Borum Hill, the name comes from the 60s, but before that it was Little Nagathnawaga, which is a Mohawk name, and it's where all the Mohawk iron workers live, like Union iron workers and steel workers who lived in Brooklyn.
There's that famous New Yorker piece from the 50s, The Mohawks of High Steel, but it told the story of, there's this whole niche that developed, people from, and you'll tell the story about Quebec and northern New York, of literally the sort of building of the city became this sort of niche that Mohawk people from that part of the world, because they built, as the story goes, they built this big bridge over the St. Lawrence River, and it sort of developed a kind of culture of not being afraid of heights. And then we're recruited here to build skyscrapers. Yeah,
and it's still, I mean, you get the Kahnawake radio station in Montreal, because Kahnawake is a First Nations reserve just off Montreal Island. And there's Mohawk talk radio and top 40 radio and DJs who are speaking in Mohawk, which is like a living language. I mean, there's sub-languages, which I don't know all the names of, but it's very much a living society that's not some mysterious layer underneath as well. It's still like very present in this whole eastern seaboard.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's, one thing that was a real pleasure in this book, I had a sort of long excursion into native place names here, but also into the language of the Lenape people who were here. And as we say, Manhattan was the sort of initial thing. And those people, it's fascinating, right? They were here by kind of 200 years after the arrival of the Dutch. Many of them had dispersed to Connecticut, New Jersey, nearby places. The Lenape people are still extant. There's a reservation in Oklahoma, and there's one up in Ontario. And the language now is being taught and sort of revived. There's only several dozen speakers. There are not many speakers of Lenape. But I had the pleasure of going to a Lenape class at this place, the Endangered Language Alliance in Manhattan, anyway, this woman drives down, 12 hours from Ontario to teach these classes, and it was a very magical thing to sort of hear the language that was spoken here before the arrival of Europeans, and people are sort of still speaking it and nurturing it, and it's a marvelous thing.
You talk in the book about the various ham-fisted ways that new Americans have tried to honor the indigenous people who were on this land when the Dutch originally arrived. There's that story about like someone wanting to construct like a huge cigar store Indian down where the Verrazano Bridge is,
Yeah, by
right?
the Narrows, exactly. In the time of William Howard Taft, he came for the groundbreaking. They wanted to make a monument for a vanishing race and to build this immense statue. This was, some decades before the bridge, of course.
And there were all these instances, I mean, we were just saying about how so many native names have been lost to time now, but there was a period of time that you discuss where all these like vacation homes or sort of like luxurious, relaxing places were given all these indigenous names. What are ways that both the state and us as individuals can honor that history without being embarrassing?
It's a great question. I mean, it's funny, in other parts of the world, Australia notably, there's a custom, for example, of doing land acknowledgement statements, and when one is giving a public presentation or writing an article and so on, and I think that's a start. It's an interesting way, at least, to sort of invoke and speak of those who've come before, right? It seems to me that just the ways in which we can think about, again, names, I think, are a really important way to do that. But the Lenape, the sort of nurturing the ways in which that language is returning, I think, is a really important thing to do here. I think it's important, for us to sort of know that history and to think about it. It's also important to acknowledge the ways in which New York City, according to the last census, there's over 100,000 people who, by their heritage and ethnicity, are Native Americans, which makes this city, the most populated place with Native American people in the country, which you don't think of. You think of Missoula or Juneau or Tucson or whatever, but there's a sort of there's a wonderful kind of community of indigenous people in this place. Many of them, by the way, from Latin America. Many people come from indigenous parts of Mexico and Central America and so on, who come here speaking not Spanish, but their own indigenous languages. And I think that, the state, that's another interesting question. I think that building a culture around sort of making those histories more visible in whatever ways we can feels important. And I'm all for, if anyone wants to take Lenape language classes, you can, with the Endangered Language Alliance, which is my favorite little nonprofit in the city. They work on, they helped me a lot with this book, and one of the things that they do is think about the ways in which New York City right now, is not only the most linguistically diverse place in the country, or in the world, which it is. The census only catches like 200 languages here, but there's certainly something like 800, maybe many more than that. And not only is it the most linguistically diverse, it's the most linguistically diverse in history, and likely the most linguistically diverse place that will ever exist, because languages are dying out all the time. And so it's a marvelous thing to sort of talk to these linguists and then the people in their network of people in those parts of Jackson Heights where people are, driving cabs or washing dishes or whatever. There's hundreds of languages spoken within a few square blocks, and it's amazing to think about the ways in which the geography of the city is sort of being described by these people all the time. New place names are sort of cropping up. It's almost an echo of history. We spoke about Harlem earlier. The Dutch name for the area west of Harlem, now the Upper West Side, was Bloemendaal, Valley of Blooms, Valley of Flowers. And the reason that was the case is because there was a place of that name to the west of Harlem in Holland. They named it that. No relation, by the way, to Bloomingdale's, which opens on 57th Street a couple hundred years later. But reading that history and then being out in Queens and talking to these folks, there's a big new, Nepali community and people from the Himalaya in Queens now, just the last 20 years or so. And a cab driver once told me about how the sort of micro-enclaves, if you like, of where people live there from different villages mirror where they live in Tibet. He said, no, they're to the north, they're to the east, they're to the west. And I was like, oh my gosh, you just sort of blew my head open. But it's the same sort of story of the sort of ways in which a sense of place or a sense of geography can sort of be transported from one place to another.
I want to go back to us talking about renaming, and I feel as if the place that we're coming from with the renaming of late is an effort sprung by racial justice efforts. And I wonder if you think there will be a new sort of renaming spurned from a different movement or effort or what have you in the next few decades. You talk in the book a little bit about climate justice, but I wonder between the two of you if there's anything that will make us start to reconsider names even 50 years from now.
I mean, the big burst was like after the revolution, we got rid of all the King Streets. Yeah. We did that once.
We had a bunch of King Streets, Queen Streets, Prince Streets.
We did a bunch after the Civil War. We did Union Streets, and they renamed Butler Street to Sterling or whatever, fine. There's a little bit of Butler left. But yeah, I wonder, short of revolution, what the next wave is.
It's a really interesting question. I mean, when I think about the sort of drive toward renaming, right? I think that there's a way in which it's an incredibly important way to sort of uncover history and sort of get at the new histories that we want to celebrate. I wonder what the next one is. I'm not certain. Yeah, the Revolutionary War. I mean, that's a moment, right, when all the royalist things are gone, right? Now, yeah, I wonder. I'm not sure.
One sort of silly question I wanted to ask you both is, would you ever have street names named after you two? Would you ever take on the honor and the privilege? Because you have this really evocative quote in the book about I guess Thomas Jefferson saying that when you honor a man when he's still alive, you sort of freeze him in time. Although you do point out the irony in how he's amassed dishonor over the years. But I wonder, will there ever be a Will Butler or Jelly-Schapiro way, street, block, place?
I'm sort of annoyed because I just texted my friend today. She's quite, anyway, complicated story. She's breaking a lease with a person. She had to hire a lawyer. She found a new place on Butler Street, already taken, next to PS 133, the William Butler School. And I was like, God damn it.
We're going to say that's you.
Like, we could say it's me. But
We're starting that
and I was
rumor
desperately
now.
trying to Google, like, what's up with this Will Butler? Like, good guy, bad guy? Like, tell me more. William A. Butler. Tell me what's going on with the school name. Couldn't find it. So we'll see. Maybe it might be a real bad dude. Like, I'm not going to stand by William Butler Elementary. For sure it's a great school. Sure they've got great teachers, whatever. But, you know, just hoping, fingers crossed here. Like, anything could happen.
All right. Well, what about, Jelly-Schapiro is a pretty weird name. I don't know that I can foresee a Jelly-Schapiro Street.
What about a borough?
Maybe name
Rename Queens Jelly-Schapiro.
solid, perhaps Queens. But there is the one of the boroughs that's named after someone is the Bronx, right? Mm-hmm. Jonas Bronk, who was a Danish fellow. It's interesting. Queens, we know the origin of. Kings, which no one calls Brooklyn. It's a tricky thing, though. I think, the Jefferson quote, I think, is apt. Someone said that it's a tricky thing to name someone before they're dead because their reputation might change, as we know about old Mr. Jefferson. But my friend Gilbert Tauber, the guy who keeps the database of all the honorary street names, he was really opposed to the naming of Regis Philbin Street up in the Bronx, which is where nothing against Regis, all for him, but he said, they did it like 20 years before he passed. We need to sort of cement a reputation before we leave that name there. So, who knows?
I still do a fist pump whenever I encounter like a good, solid, like park name. And then like something named after Governor Morris, and you're like, Governor Morris, was he good or bad? And you Google, it's like, oh yeah, anti-slavery, like hated the Senate, like, oh yeah, super into this, like Seward, all right, yeah, like Lincoln Cabinet, like okay, we're good for that. But yeah, I'm sure I'll fall into disrepute in the next couple hundred years. That'd be so depressing.
I was thinking, it's sort of a point of New York pride that I live on Dean Street, and I couldn't find anything about Dean, but I could have lived on Bergen Street, which is parallel. I could have lived on the slaveholder street, but I got a rent-stabilized apartment, and he seems like a good guy, so I feel pretty good. So, Josh, you wanted to read a selection from the book. I just wanted to make sure you had time for all of that.
I can do that with pleasure. Absolutely. I'll do so. So what I'm going to do is just read, we were sort of getting into this sort of larger question of the power of names. So I'm going to read something that's less anecdotal, but just speaks to those questions and things that have come up here. Nothing beats a statue or its tearing down for staging political dramas, or for exemplifying the ways that history, with the help of a mob's moral certitude, is made to move. When in 1992, New York City Council enacted Local Law 28, many local politicians availed themselves of the chance to erect more public memorials to Christopher Columbus's arrival in the New World 500 years earlier, though existing ones were hardly lacking. Not 30 years later, statues of Columbus, seen by many less as a hero than as a herald of colonial violence, have begun to come down. It's become an article of faith among some to say that such moves deny history, or, on the other side, that they represent an unalloyed index of progress. It's not hard to rebut the floggers of strongmen and peddlers of false equivalents who've contended that many recently removed memorials to dead Confederates, for example, are emblems of, quote, history we shouldn't forget. Their position is willful in its ignorance of the fact that most such statues date not from the time of Jefferson Davis, but from the early 1900s, generations later. They were erected during the most vile phase of the Jim Crow era to champion the continuance and cause of white supremacy. It also shouldn't be hard for any true friend of historical truth to voice anything but unalloyed gratitude for a new memorial that rose in Alabama in 2018 to take their place, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery. It commemorates the thousands of Black Americans who were killed by racial terrorists between the eras of Reconstruction and civil rights under those Confederate statues approving gays. What that memorial in Montgomery makes plain, along with allied efforts to mark where the lynchings it recalls occurred all across the South, is that sometimes it takes engaged and righteous citizens, in that case, stirred to action by the remarkable lawyer and activist Bryan Stevenson, to make our past plain, too. Names are a subtler form of public memorial than a statue made of stone. You can't toss a word in a river. There are reasons to be grateful this is so, but also vital reasons to engage why and how best to address objections to them, too. We've long made distinctions between history's chief advocates of cruelty and those who were only compliant followers. Stalingrad was renamed, though it retains many symbols of people who endured or even shaped Stalin's era. There's a reason we don't see squares or gaze at monuments named for Goebbels in Berlin. But one reason historians warn against condescending to the past is to selfishly safeguard our present. Who's to say our great-grandchildren won't reach a consensus that eating dead animals was the height of barbarism and demand the expunging of all non-vegetarians from their college syllabi and public squares? And there's another, subtler source of danger lurking in such condescension: the lack of credit we give to our own ancestors, who may have loathed or been victimized by the peculiar institution themselves, but who understood, by attaching new meanings to place names, redolent with it, Washington, Jackson, Jamaica, Harlem. The part of the power of names and our power over them is that their meanings can change. A name, it may be true, can never be completely divorced from its root. But a name is also an opportunity, and it's a hope, at the least, a hope by its coiner that it will stick, that its destiny will be more akin to, say, the fate of Adam Clayton Powell's namesake avenue in Harlem than that of the official moniker, since 2008, of the Robert F. Kennedy Bridge, which no New Yorker doesn't still call the Tri-Borough. How do you distinguish if the person describing their drive into Manhattan from Queens or the Bronx is a native or a tourist? Listen for reference to the Robert F. Kennedy Bridge. The reason some new names stick and some don't can have less to do with politics than with euphony, than with the way a name strikes our ears or rolls off our tongues or suits a story's beats. But fundamentally, the reason a name sticks is the image or vision it offers of a place and its people. Landscape is history made visible, wrote the geographer J.B. Jackson. In recent years, I've led workshops on maps and mapping in each of New York's boroughs and have seen this truth up close. Asking participants in those workshops to visually represent landscapes, both traversed and imagined, produces an astonishing range. Maps of quiet and of noise, maps of memories and of happiness, maps with made-up names, Xlandia, don't go where my ex lives, maps of places where refugees seek sanctuary, maps of the streets where one feels most comfortable on two wheels, as playfully and poignantly represented by a young woman I met who runs an organization called the Brown Bike Girl. Maps of the curb cuts and elevators that make urban life possible for those of us who are disabled and get around not on two wheels, but on four. Each of us, in these ways, inhabits a different city. Each of us, in the names we use to navigate it, also lives in one that is shared. This book grew from that conviction and from a happy autumn when I had the fortune to ride the ferry to Red Hook a few times a week. It was in an old ironworks there on a street named Pioneer, between two others named Coffee and Van Brunt, in a brick building that now houses not machines but art that it got underway. Whatever streets you're near or places you hold dear, my hope is that this book might perhaps help you see their names and what they do anew. If landscape is history made visible, the names we call its places are the words we use to forge maps of meaning in the city. On its streets, we make our way to different fates, but also intersect, if sometimes only for a moment, in shared spaces whose names can embody common understanding and can become the signs under which we learn not merely to see each other, but to see through to possible futures. Thanks.